Helmuth von Moltke the Elder said that no plan of operations extends with any certainty beyond the first contact with the main hostile force. However, no force can go into action without a plan, even in World War One, and the Battle of Jutland is no different. On the eve of the Great War, Britain and the Royal Navy was at the forefront of industrial progress. The growing power and specialisation of its various ships led them to be specialised for battle rather than for trade protection. This was all in order to counter the threat from the other side of the North Sea, where Tirpitz wanted a powerful navy to strengthen the German Empire's political power against what he considered its most important enemy, Britain. His emperor also wanted a powerful navy, but for more personal reasons. He even went as far as to submit his own designs for ships to the Imperial German Naval Office, one of which was along the lines of a British battlecruiser. Tirpitz might have been focusing on Britain, but the treaty system meant that Germany was more likely to face a two-front war against France and Russia. It was widening the Kiel Canal to allow its latest generation of large battleships to pass through, so it could be used against both the Russians in the Baltic and the French in the North Sea. Britain could see the growing power of Germany, and in 1909 the Admiralty decided that it needed to preserve its superiority of at least 60% in capital ships over Germany. To do this, they took the extraordinary step of signing the Anglo-French Naval Agreement in 1912. Under this agreement, the Royal Navy would face off against the Germans in the North Sea, while France took over the role of policing the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy's plan was to stage a distant blockade, with the Grand Fleet based all the way up in Scapa Flow, to prevent the Germans from getting out of the North Sea to attack Britain's own supply lines. Admiral Fisher guessed that a war would not come until the work on the Kiel Canal had been completed. Like everybody else in the Navy, he knew of the dangers of blockade. He knew that Tirpitz would know this as well, so he reasoned that they would wait until after that year's harvest had been brought in to give them a stockpile of food. His final guess was that it would occur on a bank holiday to prevent panic in the markets. He was right about all three things. As war was declared, the fleet was already heading north towards Scapa Flow. It left a trail of pianos and armchairs floating behind it, as their crews were getting ready for war by stripping away all the luxuries of peacetime life, as they would be a flammable liability in a ship of war. For most of the officers of the Grand Fleet, their biggest adversary now was boredom. One officer for whom that was never a problem was their leader, Admiral Jellicoe. He was a gunnery specialist, and his talent had caught the eye of Admiral Fisher. It was Fisher who insisted he be appointed to the commander of the Grand Fleet in 1914. All of his staff were amazed by his capacity for work. When Iron Duke was in harbour, he sat at a tiny writing desk in the middle of his cabin, reading dispatches or memoranda and making pencil annotations and corrections. His staff never saw him anything other than cheerful, and his calm outlook never deserted him. There was no detail too small to escape his attentions. When he read in a newspaper that one of his staff officers had become a father, he ordered the young man to go to London to collect dispatches for him, but he set everything up to allow the officer a little time with his new family. Even if he had not been visiting his wife and child, it would still have been good to get away from Scapa Flow for a while. Midshipman de Courcy Island recalled after the war how cold and unpleasant a place it was. There was only one canteen, but even that closed at 8:30. Once it did, there was nothing to do other than watch the snow slowly settling on the decks. Different ships dealt with life at Scapa Flow in different ways. HMS Agincourt had been one of the most luxurious interiors, with copious amounts of Turkish carpeting, as she had originally been built for the Turkish Navy. It was so nice that amongst the British sailors she became known as a gin court. In her wardroom, the tables were scattered with games and puzzles as the finest officers in the Royal Navy struggled for hours to find the missing piece of a horse's nose for the jigsaw that they were solving. However, all the ships could still raise steam for 18 knots in a mere 1 hour's notice. The battle cruisers, Down and Rosyth, were also kept at a constant state of readiness, but as they were closer to the city, their sailors had a slightly better time of it. The sailors would be shipped ashore in parties of 100 or so to play football or take some other exercise in Lord Elgin's Park. His lordship once found a sailor taking some exercise with one of his housemaids. When he tried to give the old sea dog a piece of his mind, the sailor simply replied that he should go to hell and get a girl for himself. But even Pleasant distractions like this could do nothing about the sense of frustration which permeated the fleet all the way to the top. Even Admiral Fisher felt it. He wrote to Jellicoe that so long as the Grand Fleet was based at Scapa Flow, it could never get south fast enough to catch the German High Seas Fleet. The only way that it could get a fight would be if the Germans decided specifically they wanted one, which they never would. You can see his frustration in the 3 exclamation marks, which is excessive even by Fisher's exuberant writing style. While the British had chosen a strategy of defensive blockade, Tirpitz's core belief was in the offensive role of the fleet. He knew that Germany was going to be blockaded, and he would need to break it. His crews were made up of conscripts who only served for 3 years, rather than the career sailors who crewed the British ships. They also spent rather less time on their ships. Their vessels had never been designed to cruise the world, so when the ships were at anchor, they walked the streets of Wilhelmshaven and slept in red brick barracks ashore. He simply could not allow his fleet to rot in harbour while they waited for the enemy to attack at a time of their choosing. Despite this, von Pohl, the Commander-in-Chief of the High Seas Fleet, mostly kept it close to his bases. Other than a few raids, they went around patrolling the minefields around Heligoland Bight or passed through the Kiel Canal to practice gunnery in Kiel Bay. One reason for this was that the war had come too early. The Germans were aiming to have a fleet of 38 battleships, but they were not due to be completed until 1920. In 1914, the High Seas Fleet was still dwarfed by the power of the Grand Fleet. The other that was already engaged in another fight, with liver cancer. On January the 18th, von Pohl was succeeded by Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer. Only a month later, he was dead. Scheer was a fire-breathing German nationalist and a protege of Admiral Tirpitz. He had the nickname of Shooting Bob, and he liked to provoke his little fox terrier into biting his friend's trousers. The German Admiralty wanted to supplant Great Britain as the leading naval power in Europe, which could only be achieved through a victor's peace. But Scheer understood that the size of the Royal Navy meant that he could not risk an all-out battle with the Grand Fleet. In command of the German battle cruisers was Vice Admiral Franz von Hipper. He was a Bavarian from Oberbayern near Munich. He had started his career in the army before transferring to the Navy in 1881 at the age of 18. He had specialised in torpedoes and torpedo boats before taking command of the first scouting group of battle cruisers. He had already fought the Royal Navy several times before Jutland and was bending under the weight of his duties. This wasn't helped by the fact that he was developing sciatica and had difficulty sleeping. Even the smallest sound could wake him up, and he'd only just returned from sick leave a few weeks before heading off to Jutland. His opposite number on the British battle cruisers was the pugnacious Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty. He was extremely loyal to his chosen band of subordinates, but he had made himself unpopular everywhere else by his haughty manner and his love of self-publicity. When they were in harbour, the Admiral's mess always dined in undress mess uniform, and 3 nights a week they had a band playing outside his cabin during dinner. He did have something of Nelson's spirit, shown in the signal that he had left flying from HMS Lion at the Battle of Dogger Bank, which summed up his conception of war. Keep nearer to the enemy. He too had already been in action several times, and he had seen how tough the German ships were. He had been lobbying for the battlecruiser squadron to be supplemented with a group of battleships. Just before Jutland, he got his wish. The mighty Queen Elizabeth-class battleships were attached to his squadron, even if they were still steeped in the Grand Fleet's rigid attitude towards commander control. This was one area where the German High Seas Fleet had a serious advantage over the Royal Navy. The German military was a firm believer in the dictum that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Unlike their stereotype, it was drummed into every officer all the way down to the NCO level that they were not there just to carry out orders. They needed to use their brains to adapt to the situation to achieve their objectives. This put them closer to Nelson's band of brothers, who had won victories at St. Vincent and Copenhagen, than to the Royal Navy itself during the Great War. Scheer outlined his plans to the Emperor in the wardroom of Frederick de Grosse. It would begin with a bombardment of the English coastal harbour of Sunderland. using their 3 fastest flotillas. This was less than 100 nautical miles from Vice Admiral Beatty's battlecruisers base at Rosyth. Beatty could not ignore an attack like this. He would bring out his battlecruisers. This would separate them from the Grand Fleet and allow Scheer to destroy them with his high seas fleet. The plan called for the use of Zeppelins for reconnaissance, but it was too windy. As the situation changed, so did the plan. Instead of Sunderland, they were going to go to the Skagerrak, close to the Jutland Peninsula. They would attack British shipping and use that as a lure the British battlecruisers into a U-boat trap. Scheer believed that he had contrived the perfect trap for the Royal Navy, and the feeling was shared by many of his other officers. They just hoped that the British battlecruisers would rise to the bait. As corvette and Captain Stutt said, "We had often bombarded their coastal towns and infested their channels with mines without once ever encountering a reaction. Would this time be different?" The problem with Scheer's plan was that it revolved around surprise, and surprising the Grand Fleet was more difficult than he thought. Since May the 17th, Room 40 codebreakers had been peeking in at his orders. Scheer was sending out. They learned about the change in target as soon as the German commanders themselves. The information was flashed up telegraph wires to Scapa and Rosyth, letting Jellicoe and Beatty know that the High Seas Fleet was assembling in the Outer Jade. Jellicoe was not going to allow the Germans to break off a piece of his fleet. He knew that he had superiority in numbers and firepower, and he intended to use it. He would give them a fight, but he would be the one choosing how. His objective was not to annihilate the enemy, but to retain command of the sea lanes that were so vital for supplying Britain. He made his own plan and then issued his orders. At Scapa, a group of officers were just beginning a game of deck hockey when the orders came in. They cheered the news. They were grateful that the long months of boredom were finally over and they were actually going to do what they were trained for. But that night, as the sun set, it turned the sky a foreboding mass of orange and blood red, as if an omen of the battle that was to come. Next time I'm going to start talking about that battle and the disastrous phase known as the Run to the South. If that sounds like something you would be interested in hearing about, then please like and subscribe so that there's a chance that the algorithm will show it to you. If not, then thank you for listening this long.